as clinicians, what we may know as a familiar framework of attachment theory that's similar is this mindfulness principle of greed, hatred, and delusion or ignorance. And when I'm talking of the elite, I'm sort of saying it's never enough. Never enough money, never enough wealth, never enough people that I own, never enough labor, never enough. It's never enough. And we can see this sort of, I was, talking a little bit about substance abuse, for example. We can see this in our own selves. Do we want to eat the whole bag of Oreos? Do we want to buy all the shoes at the store? Do we want to have more of whatever it is? And what does that mean to have that craving and to allow that craving to take the front seat, to not notice that there's this craving and this sort of greed, if you will, this sense of desire very much can be something that we can respect and bow to, but it's how it manifests. If it were to manifest as greed, that can be destructive and be an unskillful act that can negatively impact others, which can then cause harm, as it has in this system of whiteness. Not only to people of darker pigmentations, but to ourselves. Because what is given up in order to assimilate, to be able to have to be at the top of the rung? All of the people that we have to leave behind, all the people that we have to step over. And this has all kinds of manifestations, even if it's just the way that we have to do, promotions or looking for a job. We have to prove that we're better than anyone else. What if we imagined a more collective, more collaborative, world or society? And that is the way in which a lot of the indigenous folks here on Turtle Island, as it's known, before it was called Canada and the United States, that this landmass of North America's Turtle Island, that was very much the way in which collectivist cultures did and do think. That there's a role to play for everyone, and that there's going to be enough for everyone, and we can be mindful about how we go about building up resources and using energy and putting our effort in, but also in minding the collective, meaning it's not like I always want the biggest piece of the pie, right? I can sometimes take the little piece and you can have the big piece. So that greed is a huge thing to be mindful of and look at as the root, perhaps, of all of the sort of inherent quality of dominance that we see in a supremacist worldview, one that's exclusionary. White is better, black is worse. We can also look at hatred, this idea of aversion, this idea of, I don't want any of that. I want so much of this for the greed. I want none of that for the aversion. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to feel that I am a bad person. I don't want to lean into doing this anti-racism work because I'm starting to have these feelings or these truths, or I'm starting to want to say, no, it's not like that, or you don't know, or whatever it is. And that I just want to go back and read books. I want to knit. I want to crochet. I want to play with my dog. I want to enjoy my grandchildren. I want to watch Netflix. I don't want to take this in. And because I carry privilege, I don't exactly have to process it in the same way that a person of color, a black person in this country, has to live with it every day. That I have a privilege, I have an advantage of choosing when to opt in or opt out. And if I don't want to do it, I don't have to do it. Doesn't really affect me. So noticing that aversion, and at its worst, it certainly comes out when you have elected leaders, for example, or other people being actively, outwardly racist in ways that are denying people entry into this country based on their skin color or their country of origin, COVID travel restrictions notwithstanding, but in general. Or when you're really just feeling as though someone is no good just because they don't have as much money as you or something like that. Or perhaps if you live in Manhattan, like, I live in New York, and you live in a certain part of town, you don't have the right pocketbook or you don't have the right shoes, then you're not worthy, right? That this is all part of the sickness of whiteness, but it's also part of what in mindful teachings, is part of greed and hatred, which are very familiar. And then there's delusion or ignorance, which is kind of like, I didn't know, I don't know, I'm kind of lost, I'm kind of zoned out, I'm kind of checked out. I feel like I'm in a fog. I'm not really clearly seeing. I'm not able to be with what's here because I'm not able to cultivate a relationship to recognizing what's arising. And this, I think, is, again, one of the styles that we may have or we may find ourselves in when we receive imprintings, especially racialized imprintings around who is better, who is worth. We look at white beauty standards, for example. We look at, people like Farrah Fawcett as, being maybe the pinnacle of beauty or something, as blonde and buxom and whatnot. And that's not obviously what everybody looks like. But that we're sort of ignorant to the fact that if we're sort of ignorant to like, that is there is a standard that has been put out there. If we're not that, we're going to just be unconsciously trying to be that and then being so frustrated if, for example, you look like me, or maybe you're 5'2" and you're not 5'10", or maybe you're 200 pounds and not 100 pounds, or whatever it is. And that all those things can cause a lot of suffering if we're not aware that there is a system that has been set up. And if we actually believe that we have to somehow find a way to fit into that system, as opposed to interrogating the origins of this system, which is part of the basic mindful teachings of really interrogating the origin of what the suffering is. That's the pain and the suffering certainly exists, but what's the origin and what's our relationship to it? And then from that place of awareness, we can start to do things that are intentional. And so from a therapeutic perspective, if we're going to sort of make a parallel with what we would call, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and Mary Maines and all the attachment theory work around secure attachment, which is basically like, I'm balanced, I have perspective, I don't overly take on or take in things that I don't feel are true, but I'll check and see, are you just saying something about me because you're being a bully right now? Or is there really something I need to be accountable for and check in with myself about to see, perhaps I did cause harm and I'll apologize and I'll try to make a repair. Right? So as we have that and cultivate that secure attachment, it's easier to, when there is rupture, make repair, to lean in and say, yep, there was a rupture here, and now I'm ready to handle my place in working with it. When we're in a more insecure attached place, there is perhaps the ambivalent attachment, which is that preoccupied attachment, which is more the idea of, I don't really know if this is or isn't going to happen. It's kind of unpredictable over there. And so I'm going to always lean in, and I'm always going to kind of try to pre-know, and I'm going to sort of take up space. And so if I can map it all up ahead of time, I'm going to feel safer. I'm going to feel better. And so there's always this sort of freneticism, and we would call it, from a nervous system perspective or a polyvagal theory perspective, perhaps a bit of charge there around hyperarousal, activating that sort of sympathetic arena. And then for the dismissive attachment or the avoidant insecure attachment, we might have more that walled off, checked out, withdrawn, sort of way of being more lower energy or harder energy that's kind of not very involved, not very interactive. And maybe you have clients that have alexithymia that don't really talk about their feelings or aren't familiar with what's actually happening with them in terms of sensation, have a hard time accessing what it's like to actually have a body and be in a body. And, that this sort of avoidant attachment usually comes around when you've tried to be met as a child and you really haven't. And so you just kind of say, I'm not going to rely on you. I'm going to do it on my own. I'm going to figure out a way to survive. And it's a beautiful survival strategy. It's a beautiful adaptation. The preoccupied or ambivalent attachment is the one that always says, well, I'm going to figure it out, and that's how I survive. This one says, I waited, you never came, I had to do it on my own, and I had to shut down the pain and the terror of what it's like to have this sort of alarmed aloneness around me not being able to be supported, and I'm going to do it by myself. And then we have the disorganized attachment around unpredictability, the object of my sort of nourishment is also the object of my abuse, meaning that I may have someone who is feeding me 1 minute, but at the same time hitting me another. And so I really have a challenging time with being in relationship to that caregiver as a child. And so what I would invite you to consider is how these three modes of attachment, primarily secure versus, insecure attachment, avoidant and preoccupied and disorganized, but really more avoidant and preoccupied or ambivalent. How do they parallel these Buddhist teachings of greed, hatred, and delusion or ignorance? Is there a way that we can help use this as a process of understanding, and maybe a way of understanding our culture of whiteness as it's been imprinted as a conditioned mind? If we think of ourselves as this big cultural soma of all these neural pathways and all these limbic conditionings and imprintings over time of centuries that have been put in us through whiteness, through the systematized legalization of separation and allocation along racial lines, along melanin levels. And we've categorized things, we've come up with names, we've given certain people rights and whatnot, right? That perhaps I would invite you to consider, are we not in a cultural body of a bit of avoidant or dismissive attachment, where it's very difficult for us to even really look, and it's easier for us to sort of keep away because the truth of what that might mean is really hard to bear, and we haven't really had a reckoning. We haven't brought out from under the shadows up into the light the truth of what the history of this country is. And so for a lot of people who have been living the reality of what it's like to sustain exposure and be the ones who are objectified by a society of racial hierarchy and one that holds whiteness supreme, Black people in this country, people of color, have had to endure what that means. What is it like now to use this moment of the uprising and of COVID to start to pull out of that perhaps avoidant attachment style, where privilege of being white enables us to not have to do it and still move into the center of health, using I'm enough and I matter, using that as a sense of collective belonging, not skipping ahead to this place of, well, we all should get along and we're all the same, but really being with the place of, here's what I need to do to pull myself in to a place of relationality and become intimate with myself in a way that may feel scary, but that also enables me to be tender and vulnerable and intimate with others who are of different melanated levels, including my clients, including people in community, so that I can really show up and take this moment further to the next level. Again, remembering that I've set the compass of my heart toward collective liberation, and that none of us are free unless all of us are free. And that starts here, that this is the work I can do to begin with. I also want to suggest that when we talk about racism, racism has been described as a definition of like power plus privilege or prejudice plus power, excuse me. And there are a lot of different ways in which we can think about what it's like to actually be racist, and the ways in which we think about ourselves as racist or not, and what comes up for us, and how even just saying the word, oftentimes, just like saying the word incest, that people who say the word may feel that they become targeted because they've named something that society or culture outwardly deems to be horrible, but in reality affects at least 20% of the population, probably more, right? And so as we sort of lean into this knowing and this learning, what is racism, that there's something there about power, and there's something there about equity, and there's something there about, it's not just prejudice, meaning that I have a preference or I have an idea or belief, but it's that I have access to, and I can use my power to manipulate a situation where I have access or continued access to something that is denied to others based on their skin color. And as we look at that, we really look at whiteness as this system of superiority that then uses racism to uphold it, meaning that if I continue to have this idea that there is a right dominant place and there is a worse lesser place, and that's based on skin color, I will continue to be existing in a racist framework. And unless I'm aware of that, and unless I turn my ship around so that I become an embodied anti-racist and work on that path, I'm still existing within that framework, whether or not I realize it or not. That's the program that's running, because we've all inherited it. And a lot of times it's internal. You know, I've heard people use the word neurodecolonization. It's quite something for you neuroscience geeks out there like me, right? And decolonizing therapy and the ways in which that we can take out the superiority and still find healing in more of a biological, sort of more ecospheric family systems type of approach that isn't based on hierarchy, but is based on interconnectedness and interdependence, which is also part of a core mindful teaching about causality, right? That things are always in relationship. Gene Yunlin, the focuser, philosopher, you know, worked with Carl Rogers, you know, his big thing was we are interaction. And so if we have this avoidant dismissive attachment style, how can we really be interaction with our brothers and sisters that have different colors? And so the invitation is to kind of be aware of that and step into the circle of health.